So what I want to talk about today is basically the work that the Convention on Biological Diversity is doing with regards to reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, REDD+. In preparing the presentation, I basically assumed that most of the audience would be familiar, at least in broad strokes, with REDD+, that it's an instrument under the Climate Change Convention with the aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the forest sector. What may be less obvious is why the Convention on Biological Diversity is working on REDD+. After all, if a forest is not cut down for carbon storage, that should have very obvious benefits for biodiversity as well. And yes, that is so, but at the same time, if REDD+ is not designed and implemented in a way that keeps biodiversity in mind, then it can also be harmful for biodiversity. And our job is to hold up the biodiversity flag and make sure that, that when designing and implementing REDD+, biodiversity is considered. So what I want to present today is basically give a short overview of what the CBD is, what it does, and give an overview of the most relevant CBD decisions regarding REDD+. I then want to give a short introduction to two very concrete requests that from our Conference of the Parties on which we're working. One is on the application of biodiversity safeguards in the REDD+ process, and the other is on the exploration of possible indicators and mechanisms for measuring the impact of REDD+ on biodiversity and on indigenous and local communities. And then I thought, being here at the Research Institute, I take the opportunity and present some of the further development and research needs that we perceive at the policy level. So what is the CBD? The CBD is one of the three Rio Conventions, along with the Climate Change and the Certification Convention, that was open for signature at Rio in 1992. The CBD has 193 parties. That's almost universal membership, except for two countries that I'm aware of. One is the Vatican, and the other one is the United States. The CBD has three objectives. One is the conservation of biological diversity, the second is the sustainable use of its elements, and the third is the equitable sharing of benefits that are arising out of the use of genetic resources. How does the CBD function? Well, it functions largely through programs of work on different issues. There's a program of work on agricultural biodiversity, for example. There's one on marine and coastal biodiversity. There's one on islands, one on dry and subhumid lands. And then there's also one on forest biodiversity. And the work of the Secretariat with regards to REDD+ falls under the program of work on forest biodiversity. Now the CBD has been working on REDD+ issues for a long time, actually for longer than the term REDD+ has been around. The first program of work was adopted in 2002, and it contains 130 measures to promote biodiversity in forests, to promote good governance in forests, and these 130 measures include measures that today would be considered as being closely tied to REDD+, including measures to combat climate change, measures to combat habitat fragmentation, to promote forest restoration, to set incentives right for biodiversity in forests, and so forth. Then at COP9 in 2008, the term REDD+, or REDD at that time, appeared for the first time in CBD decisions, and that's basically the broadest mandate that we have to work on REDD+. And that is our Conference of the Parties asked parties and other relevant organizations to ensure that possible actions for REDD do not run counter to the objectives of the CBD and the implementation of the first program of work, but support the implementation of the CBD and provide benefits for biodiversity and indigenous and local communities. Then 2 years later, in 2010, at our last COP, the CBD adopted a new strategic plan for biodiversity for the period from 2011 to 2020. That has generally been considered as the most important outcome of the last Conference of the Parties. And that strategic plan is not only a plan for the CBD convention, but it's considered a framework for all biodiversity-related conventions and for all stakeholders in the field of biodiversity. The plan has a vision to live in harmony with nature by 2050. It has a mission to take effective and urgent action to halt the loss of biodiversity in order to ensure that by 2020 ecosystems are resilient and continue to provide the essential services on which we all depend. But at the core of the strategic plan are really 20 targets, the so-called Aichi targets. And these targets are ambitious but realistic. And of course I don't have the time to go into all 20 of those targets, but I just want to highlight 4 of them that are particularly relevant to forests, and as I'll explain later, also particularly relevant to reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. The first of those targets is target 5, which aims that at least to half forest deforestation, and where feasible bring it close to 0 by 2020. Then there's target 7, to manage all areas under forestry sustainably by 2020. Target 11, to conserve at least 17% of terrestrial areas by 2020 in appropriate protected areas. And then there's target 15, to restore at least 15% of all degraded ecosystems by 2020. And of course these targets very closely match the objectives of reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. As you know, target 5 is basically reduced deforestation. Target 7 refers, or is closely linked to one of the aspects under the plus in REDD+, sustainable management of forests. Target 11 is also closely linked to one of the pluses, which is the conservation of forests. And target 15 is also linked to REDD+, in that it refers to what in the Climate Change Convention is called enhancement of carbon stocks. So what I want to point out here is that there's a great potential of synergies in realizing the CBD strategic plan and in realizing the objectives of REDD+ and the Climate Change Convention, and parties should make use of those synergies in trying to achieve both objectives. Now, to ensure that that the objectives of the CBD are met under REDD+, our last COP has also given the Secretariat of the CBD 2 concrete requests on which to work. One is to provide advice on safeguards, to make sure that biodiversity and the issues important to indigenous and local communities are considered in REDD+, and the other is to explore options for monitoring and assessment of the impacts of REDD+ on biodiversity and indigenous and local communities. So on the first issue on safeguards, we have held 4 expert workshops in 2010 and 2011. One was global, and the other 3 were divided by region. One for Asia Pacific, one for Latin America and the Caribbean, and one for Africa. And these workshops were really well attended by representatives from 63 CBD parties and 55 international organizations, NGOs, private sector organizations, indigenous and local communities. And at its most basic, really, the participants in the workshops agreed that safeguards and multiple benefits for biodiversity, for livelihoods, for other ecosystem services, for adaptations, and so forth, are really the basis for future carbon benefits that are supposed to flow from REDD+, and ultimately for payments for carbon and for other ecosystem services. What we asked participants at the workshops was first to outline what they perceived as the main risks to biodiversity and the main risks to indigenous peoples and local communities. And some of the risks that they identified, I've put on the slide here, With regards to biodiversity, that is the conversion of natural forests, the displacement or leakage of deforestation and forest degradation. Increased pressure on non-forested ecosystems with high biodiversity value. Afforestation in areas of high biodiversity value. And with regards to risks to indigenous peoples and local communities, there was the risk of loss of traditional territories and restriction of land and natural use rights. Also, lack of tangible livelihood benefits from REDD+ was perceived as a risk, and the exclusion, general exclusion from designing and implementing REDD+ policies and measures. Now, based on this identification of risks, we asked the participants to check how the 3 current safeguards approaches that are out there by the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, by the UN REDD program, and the REDD+ social and environmental standards, how those approaches deal with those risks and whether those approaches are adequate to make sure that these risks are mitigated. And in general, participants found that the 3 approaches were adequate in principle, but they also found a few caveats of issues that were not covered and that should be covered. So, for example, in the 3 approaches, there's no specific mention of safeguards for enhancement of forest carbon stocks, so for reforestation or forest restoration. It was also unclear in these frameworks what was the impact on traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use of indigenous and local communities. And generally, participants felt that there was a need to harmonize the 3 different safeguards approaches at the national level. There was also a very long list of key findings coming out of the workshops, including the need for developing and applying REDD+ safeguards at the national level, which is what I just said. The urgent need to clarify land tenure issues, which is still one of the key problems in REDD+. Also the need to build on existing guidance as it exists, for example, under the CBD with regards to afforestation and reforestation in a biodiversity-friendly manner, or with regards to access and benefit sharing, which is also one of the areas where the CBD has expertise. But there were also aspects that we've been working on, and this is an aspect that is not as developed as the safeguards issue yet. We've been exploring possible indicators and mechanisms for measuring the impact of REDD+ on biodiversity and indigenous and local communities. And with regards to indicators, it became very quickly apparent that indicators, of course, need to be cost-effective and feasible, and given these considerations, it's not possible to develop a huge range of new indicators and mechanisms to measure them, but rather we have to piggyback on existing indicators that are used and existing mechanisms that are presently already working out there. So out of this consideration, it's possible to group indicators into 3 categories. Basically, category A, indicators that are already out there, ready for use at the global level. Such indicators include, for example, trends in the extent of forest cover, or trends in the extent of forest type, trends in area under certification, for example, under FSC. Second category would be indicators that are ready that are for use at the global level, but that still need further development. So those would be indicators, for example, measuring extinction risks, trends in area of degraded forests, which is a big issue but very hard to measure, trends in fragmentation of forests, and so forth. And then we also had a 3rd category of indicators that we perceived as mostly useful at the national level and subnational level. For example, trends in illegal logging, areas under sustainable forest management, or ecological connectivity. Now, with regards to mechanisms to measure those indicators, there are already a number of monitoring and assessment mechanisms out there. that could provide the useful data and analysis for the global indicators. And these mechanisms include the reports that we get from our parties on their national status of biodiversity. We get those reports every 4 years, and they, depending on the country where we get that from, they can vary quite a bit in their quality. And then there is the FAO's Forest Resource Assessment, which is probably the most widely used assessment mechanism in forests. In addition to that, there are reports of pilot countries on their activities, which they submit to the REDD program or to the FCPF. There is some useful data from IUCN in the REDD list, for example. But in general, it's, as you can see from these examples that I've been giving, there seems to be more available, both in terms of indicators that are developed and in terms of assessment mechanisms. There seems to be more available on biodiversity than on indigenous and local communities. Now, as I said, I want to use this opportunity to outline some of the development and research needs as we perceive them at the policy level. And one of that is that we need more spatial data on biodiversity, particularly spatial data on the congruencies between carbon and biodiversity, so carbon and biodiversity overlays in different forest types. We need more data on flows of ecosystem services and on how biodiversity and ecosystem services respond to different forest management regimes or to different REDD+ activities. We also need improved analytical frameworks for carbon biodiversity cost trade-offs. How do you deal with trade-offs for carbon and biodiversity? Then we need feasible but at the same time robust methods of field monitoring of REDD+ impacts, including with the participation of indigenous and local communities. We need monitoring of forest degradation, and we need monitoring of its impacts on carbon, biodiversity and ecosystem services. And we need generally a better understanding of the linkages between ecosystem services and their provision and the interaction with indigenous and local communities. I know that this has been quite a tough force tour through what we've been doing, and if you're interested in the details of what we're doing, I would like to guide you to this document which contains the draft advice for our next conference of the parties on REDD+. And the document basically calls for synergies in the implementation of REDD+ and the CBD strategic plan. It supports the safeguards initiatives of the FCPF, the UN REDD program, and the REDD+ social and environmental standards. At the same time, it also recommends certain improvements. It lists specific concerns to be taken into account when addressing REDD+ in planning and development. It outlines cost-effective monitoring options for REDD+ impacts, and it outlines some of the further development and research needs that I've just spoken about. Before coming to an end, let me point you to two publications that I've brought along. I'm afraid there's not one copy for everyone here, but you can also get them at the CBD website. And these summarize risks and benefits of REDD+ for biodiversity, ecosystem-based adaptation, and for local livelihoods. Thanks very much.
Can you talk about what you mean by safeguards?
Right, yeah, safeguards is basically, as I said, as I started out saying, the impacts of REDD+ on biodiversity and indigenous and local communities are expected to be positive, but that's not certain. If a forest is left standing, that's most likely very good for biodiversity. Whether that's necessarily good for indigenous and local communities is a bit more tricky. But but some of the aspects under REDD Plus are not necessarily positive for biodiversity either. For example, you could imagine scenarios where a forest is cut down, the timber is sold off, and on the area where the forest was standing, people put a plantation. So the plantation is of much lower biodiversity value than the original forest. Now, under some scenarios, this could be eligible for REDD Plus funding. And this is, of course, something that the Convention of Biological Diversity wants to make sure that this is not happening. So what safeguards basically means, we need to have certain systems, certain rules in place to make sure that things like this cannot happen. And these safeguards can refer to biodiversity. So, for example, making sure that there is no conversion of national forests, making sure that if forest is conserved in one area because of a REDD Plus system, that the deforestation does not move to another place, either to another forest or to another high biodiversity value ecosystem. So these rules need to be in place. The same thing for indigenous and local communities, making sure that they actually benefit from REDD Plus, making sure that they have a say in how, well, first of all, whether they want a REDD Plus project in their area or not, and if so, if it is, to make sure that they actively participate in designing and implementing.
I should know the answer to this, but I don't. If you look at carbon emissions, what fraction is from forestry questions and what fraction is from, say, fossil fuels?
Well, it changes every now and then, but a rough estimate for the emissions that are coming out of due to deforestation and forest degradation is between 12 and 20% of overall emissions. We usually say 17.
And fossil fuels is what percent of overall emissions?
I don't know.
I think it's close to 12 or 15, or somewhere on that order.
12 to 15%?
Well, it depends on how you're cutting the
Fossil
pie.
fuels?
Maybe it's a third. It's not as large as you would expect.
Well, I wouldn't have expected it to be that large, but
Okay.
other people might. I
In
didn't expect
terms
it.
of the growth of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, deforestation is 17%.
Yes.
Fossil fuels are 12%. That's the
But I think the problem is...
No, that's not the change in concentration. 70% of the annual emissions are from deforestation, but there's also global regrowth of forests, so the net release from the forest sector is a little bit lower. It's about half that.
Half of 17?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very interesting presentation and a lot to absorb. In terms of deforestation, you have a goal set of 20 to eliminate deforestation. How is that set and how realistic is that in terms of the current trends for deforestation?
Didn't you say half it? Half it?
It's half it.
Well, no, it says to eliminate it by 2020.
It says half it, and if possible, if feasible, bring it close to zero.
Oh, I see. Well, that's not what it said.
Yeah, that's a very ambitious target. And there's, if feasible, bring it close to zero. That allows for some leeway in the implementation. In general, deforestation has been reduced definitely in the last years. Brazil, for example, has made huge progress in bringing down the rate of deforestation. I think a lot of it will depend on timber imports in China, for example, in the emerging markets. Generally, I think this global goal there's some possibility that this can be achieved. It's unlikely to bring it close to zero, but to have the rate of deforestation, I think there is a potential for this to be achieved. It's also important to know that these targets are global targets, which does not mean that every country has to achieve 50% reduction in their deforestation rates. So it's also possible that some countries achieve more and other countries achieve less. That, of course, makes it difficult in monitoring and enforcement, in the sense that it's difficult to monitor.
It's encouraging. It'll be challenging to get there, I think,
Yeah.
but it's encouraging that the people that are planning this feel that that's achievable. So.
Yeah. Well, it's a global target on which 193 countries have agreed that they want to achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, it's a target. It's a soft target. It's a country cannot be held accountable if it's not achieved.
You had mentioned that there are fewer indicators for community and indigenous issues than biodiversity. Can you talk a little bit more about what indicators there are and efforts to expand that? Or where you're going with that?
Yeah, indicators that would be useful for us would include, for example, indicators on the health of indigenous local communities, indicators on their well-being, indicators on nutritional status of indigenous local communities and so forth. Indicators that can be linked to the impacts of REDD+. So you have...
So looking at the physical health of individuals as opposed to governance or other... Right.
Well, on the one hand, but also on indicators that allow us to measure, for example, trends in sustainable use, customer sustainable use by indigenous local communities, or trends in the application of traditional knowledge. Those would be very useful indicators to develop and to use. The problem appears to be, and we are happy if we can get more input. If you could point us to a mechanism that's already out there where the indicators as such, like these, are measured, then we'd be happy to take them on board. But
something you could tell us now.
Yeah, that seems to be the problem. Whereas for biodiversity, you have more assessment mechanisms out there that could be where biodiversity aspects could potentially be included or strengthened. For example, in the FAO Forest Resources Assessment.
Jumping back to the previous question about they've noticed declines in deforestation. How much of that is due to just the fact that we're in a global economic recession versus how much of that is due to meaningful policies in place that are actively controlling deforestation?
Yeah, I think the answer lies somewhere in the middle. In general, the global recession has helped a lot to keep deforestation rates down. At the same time, if you look at Brazil, for example, they have pursued very strict policies to bring down the deforestation rate. So the answer is somewhere in the middle. There is, on the one hand, a very strong need for good policies, good forest governance. At the same time, being in a recession helps in this regard. In theory, for REDD+, in theory, it's well, as it is in the climate change laid down in the Climate Change Convention, it's only Annex 1 countries, only developing countries. But in fact, it's even a narrower group than that, because priority is given to countries that have a lot of forest and preferably have tropical forests. So if you look at the countries that are pilot countries for this REDD+ mechanism, countries that are associated with the UN REDD program or with the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, those are by and large tropical forest countries. There's now some move to extend that to countries in the subtropics, like Sudan, which is a country that generally does not have much forest, but it's generally tropical forests, tropical forest countries.
And just on a follow-up on that, isn't there a concern that if you start protecting these, you're just going to get shifting to, they're going to keep shifting to the forests that aren't going to fall under this protection scheme?
Yes, that's definitely one of the great problems. Not only across international borders. So if you protect forests in one country, deforestation will move to another country, but also within national borders. If you protect one area in a country, deforestation may move to another.
Well, I have two questions. One is regarding the CBD process, and I was wondering that the U.S. is not a signatory, and previously there were issues with the American lawyers gaining access to the floor even though they didn't have a seat at the table. And I was, that was happening with the genetic resources very much more strongly about 6 years ago. So I was wondering if those dynamics have changed at the COP meetings, if you have still that influence happening. And then the second aspect is regards to specifically the European EU biofuels, how the palm oil plantations, I was wondering, has that disrupted the focus and flow of what's been going on at CBD recently, in the last couple of years?
Well, the first question, as I'm aware that the US has observer status at the CBD. So in any COP meeting, the US is allowed to speak and to participate. Usually, in the ABS negotiations, that was a particular subject because that was very conflicted, and so I'm not really involved in that. So, but I think it is very possible that the US could then not contribute to the negotiations because it's not a party to the convention. But in general, in other subjects, the way the process works is an observer may raise a comment or suggest certain wording, and the US may do that just as other observers, which could be international organizations, for example. But that would then need the support of one of the parties. But in fact, this means this is usually not a problem for the US. If you guys want to have a certain language in there, it's usually not a problem to have another country support your suggestion.
Well, yeah, they were always going through Canada and Australia before, that was sort of one of the issues confronting.
In general, the CBD process is much more open than, for example, the climate change process. But that's not, the US is party to the climate change convention, so you don't have any problems there. With regards to biofuels and palm oil plantations, yes, biofuels is a big issue on the CBD agenda now. And palm oil plantations, of course, very closely tied to the problematics of REDD+. There's certain countries in Southeast Asia pushing for palm oil plantations being included, potentially included under the REDD+ mechanism, so that they would be able to draw benefits under the REDD+ mechanism for palm oil plantations. For example, as a measure for enhancement of forest carbon stocks, saying that that's a forest and we're enhancing carbon stocks. And that is obviously one of the areas where the CBD wants to apply safeguards.
So I wanted to ask you about one of the targets, which was that all forests would be sustainably managed by 2020. I was wondering what indicators the convention is relying on for that. Is it Montreal process, criterion indicators? Is it FSC? And is it assuming that those would be used consistently and uniformly globally, or is it up to the reporting of the individual countries? Could you just flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah. all these things are still very much under development. So, as I said, we're in the context of REDD+, we're exploring options for how to measure impacts of REDD+ on biodiversity. With respect to the strategic plan, we are undergoing a very similar process in that we are currently exploring options for measuring progress on the plan, and those would include questions of how do we measure what is sustainable change.
Okay.
I think what
Mental question.
yeah, but I think what it will come down to is that what will be used is area under some kind of certification scheme. So I don't think that there will
So that would drop out, 150 million acres of forest land in the U.S., 1/3 of the forest, because we're not going to certify our national forests.
Yeah.
So there are some interesting questions there.
Yeah.
Who's representing the U.S. on that part of this, or are we not represented because we're not signatory?
I don't think there will be someone who's representing the U.S. specifically
on forestry
on this
question.
issue. No, I don't
Yeah.
think so. Usually there is someone from the Department of Agriculture, but I don't think that this will be a key preoccupation on that person's mind.
I want to give a couple of other people and come back to you. Jean.
I'm curious, to go back to the safeguard question, I'm curious if you think safeguards for biodiversity would need to take measures to include indigenous livelihoods, or if you think it doesn't need to happen that way, that we can have safeguards for biodiversity as well as separate safeguards for indigenous livelihoods. Like, is there a danger of one or the other if you don't do both in the same way?
No, I don't think so. I think, yes, you need separate safeguards for indigenous local communities and for biodiversity because the issues are different. But at the same time, I think anyone who deals with safeguards clearly realizes that the success of REDD+ hinges on the implementation of safeguards, whether they be for biodiversity or for indigenous and local communities. Basically, the argument for biodiversity is that if you don't put in safeguards for biodiversity, if you don't make sure that the forest which you're conserving is biodiverse, you're undermining the forest's resilience, and therefore you're undermining the permanence of the carbon stock. And the same argument can be made for indigenous and local communities, where if you don't have safeguards in place, if you don't ensure that indigenous and local communities benefit from REDD+ and that they're involved and participate in the implementation and design of REDD+, then you put in danger your carbon stock because you cannot build a fortress conservation area and keep local communities out. There's a potential for sabotage, for all kinds of issues. So it's really clear that indigenous and local communities are the key stakeholders in this that need to be involved, otherwise the mechanism wouldn't work.
Since you said it, I'll ask, you mentioned carbon pricing. As I understand, this basically is a scheme for giving credit for carbon storage. But how much, especially in the sense of feasibility, would life be easier for you in this program if there was a worldwide carbon price for emissions?
Under the climate change negotiations, it's not clear yet whether this will be a market-based instrument or whether it will be a fund-based instrument. In a fund-based instrument, you could imagine that you set a certain carbon price.
But that's for the benefits.
Yeah.
If you store so much carbon, at the same time, the rest of the world is working in a situation in which carbon emissions are not priced. I'm maybe asking a bigger question, but let me ask you this. If carbon were priced, would that factor at all into the process here?
Yes, definitely. Because, and carbon is priced in certain markets in the European trading system, and I think out in California you have similar systems. And of course, yes, the price of carbon there, which includes prices for carbon reductions in industry, has a very strong bearing on potential benefits that flow through REDD. So if the price for carbon is low due to other sectors, then the price for carbon in the first sector is also low, which reduces the benefits and the strength of this instrument.
So the parties are national governments, and local communities and indigenous groups might not have the same priorities and perspectives of national governments. So how are their concerns entered into the deliberations of the convention in things like even how they might want to set their own indicators for sustaining local and indigenous communities?
That's a very good question, and one of the big problems in the Climate Change Convention. I'm sure you've heard about the protests against the sidelines of the Climate Change Convention. In the CBD, the process is much more transparent and more transparent and more participatory. Indigenous and local community organizations and representatives are much more free to voice their opinions at a CBD COP than they are at a UNEP COP. Also at the CBD, most deliberations are open, whereas most of the REDD Plus negotiations at the Climate Change Convention are behind closed doors.
So this might be a way for them to get their voice into climate change if it's a key priority for you all.
Yes.
And you're trying to, highlight these synergies and safeguards.
That is how it is. That is very much how it is perceived by many of indigenous and local communities.
Just following up on that, you mentioned there were synergies between the goals under CBD and under the Climate Convention, but are there formal mechanisms for the CBD kind of voicing providing input? I mean, I guess bluntly, does the Climate Convention have to take your recommendations into consideration?
Well, there is a formal mechanism called the Joint Liaison Group between the conventions, but that's not the best way to pitch that, because there are all kinds of strategic issues that make it complicated through this route. What I think is more important is to keep in mind that the parties to the CBD are the same parties that are parties to the UNEP, except with some exceptions, as the US, which is only party to one convention. But in generally, it's the same countries. So you should think that if you convince people in the government of the country under the CBD about the importance of biodiversity in REDD+, that should then inform their colleagues who are representing the same country under the Climate Change Convention. In reality, it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, the problem with synergies at the international level is very similar to the problem of synergies at the national level between, say, the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Agriculture. It's often very difficult for these people to talk to each other and to get to similar conclusions and to achieve a similar standpoint. So, de facto, what we're trying to do to facilitate this is, for example, that in these 4 workshops that we organized, we invited representatives of the CBD constituency at the same time with representatives of the UNEP constituency. So we basically invited a representative from the Ministry of Environment, which deals with the CBD, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Agriculture, or a different department in the Ministry of Environment that deals with climate change. And that many instances it was the first time that these people ever talked to each other.
Alison, did you have a question? That was starting to get at what my question is, but I'm interested to know about the political barriers. So, what are the major stakeholder groups that are maybe proponents with opposing the CBD priorities? And I'm also curious whatever perceptions you have about why the U.S. is not a signatory to the CBD.
I think one of them, a lot of it has to do with friction in the process of getting an argument out there. As I said, in many countries it's not that people who negotiate under the climate change conventions don't want to think about biodiversity or have a straight out conflict with biodiversity. It's often just simply that they're not aware of the importance of biodiversity in this mechanism. They want to keep it simple, they want to keep it focused on carbon and not having to deal with all these other complications like indigenous people and biodiversity. So our efforts in the past have focused on making the argument that these are not just nice add-ons that make the thing more complicated, but they're also key components that ensure the functioning of the mechanism.
Who are the specific proponents, and other than, say, the UNEP to receive, what about industry or other stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean the plantation industry, for example, that's they're a big opponent to the biodiversity idea. Timber industry, also very sustainable forest management is more costly and that's a problem as well. Why the US is not signatory? That's I think that's a historical question. I mean, not really really up to speed on the exact what exactly was happening.
I think Al Gore represented the U.S. at the Rio conference and signed, but wasn't able to get the Senate to ratify it. It was introduced, but the Senate was Republican controlled, or it was shortly thereafter under Gingrich, and was never ratified.
I think that the general problem was that the U.S. that there was big resistance in the U.S. because there was a fear that certain rules and laws would not be made in the U.S. anymore, essentially. Which, ironically, is the CBD works very much as an instrument of soft law, so that that particular fear was unnecessary, as it proved in hindsight. Because, but at that point, it may have been valid. And then
you're being very kind.
And then why the U.S. is not joining today? That's a question you have to ask your representatives and senators.
If I may just jump in really quickly on that question of the soft law, whoops, I'll be very quick. Which is, the reporting and monitoring. There's so much politicization of the data that gets reported in, for instance, the FAO reports. If CBD is a global institution and we really have the opportunity to do this global monitoring, which is absolutely critical, is there any effort at all, given the sovereign right of the countries to do what they need to do, is there any effort at all to supersede some of the data reporting to cross-check it? Because we have remote sensing information to say, this is not correct, what you're reporting.
Yeah, that's one of the big discussion points under the Climate Change Convention, what happens if a country misreports, or what happens if a country does not comply, for example, with safeguards. Is there an enforcement mechanism to make them do whatever they said they would do? Basically, since REDD is a voluntary instrument, a country can join or cannot join. I think the lever here is to say if you do not
Actually, CBD though.
Yeah, yeah.
Long-term biodiversity, forest cover, for instance.
I don't see any
Any alternative?
I don't see any lever that the CBD would have to make a country comply. Whereas under REDD, there is this lever. If you don't participate, you don't get any money.
Bill,
Can we
last
comment?
question. Yes,
Okay.
please.
Just this morning, a couple of us were having a conversation about the proposal for a market for biodiversity. So payments for biodiversity conservation, similar to carbon market mechanisms. I'm wondering whether this is an issue that your Secretariat is beginning to wrestle with. And because I'm really curious how those two would fit together. We have a carbon market and biodiversity market, and if these are co-benefits often of the same projects, would those be integrated somehow under one market protocol? Is that the idea?
Yeah, there's definitely thoughts of integrating the two. Usually, in our speak, we talk about the stacking of benefits. So if you would have an area where you that you have under a REDD mechanism where you generate carbon benefits, at the same time you are generating biodiversity benefits. Now you could issue certificates that could be bought and sold at the market, for example, which considers both benefits. Then you could have, for example, different categories of certificates. You could have a gold standard, you could have a silver standard and a bronze standard, for example. And the higher the standard, the more the more benefits you get overall. But that leads to one of the research needs that I mentioned in the presentation, and that is how do you deal with trade-offs? You could imagine an area where if you implement a REDD Plus project, you get relatively less carbon benefits than if you implemented the same project in another area, which can store more carbon. But at the same time, in the first area, you would have extremely high biodiversity benefits. So how do you deal with that? How do you, and that's one of the open questions.
Well, our time is over, so thanks for the great questions, and thank you especially to Johannes.